The Cipher and the Sea, June 3rd, 1942, 0400 hours, North Pacific. The ink-black water stretched endlessly beneath a moonless sky. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck, feeling the cold spray against his face. The great warship cut through the waves with mechanical precision, part of a formation so vast it seemed invincible. 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 12 destroyers, a moving fortress of steel and purpose. Around him, mechanics made final adjustments to Zero fighters lined wingtip to wingtip, their propellers catching the dim glow of shielded lamps. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt air. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and sand that would, they believed, draw out what remained of the American Pacific Fleet for annihilation. Genda inhaled deeply, tasting victory before it arrived. Everything had been planned with meticulous care. The element of surprise was theirs. It had to be. In that moment, in that darkness before dawn, the Japanese officer could not have known that 3,000 miles away, in a basement in Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had already read his orders. They knew he was coming, they knew when, they knew where, and they were waiting. 6 months earlier, the Pacific had belonged to Japan. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, its battleships broken and smoking in the shallow harbor waters. The Philippines were falling. Singapore, the great British fortress, would surrender in humiliation. Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, all had fallen like dominoes before the advancing tide of the Imperial Japanese Navy. To Japanese planners in Tokyo, to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, the strategy seemed flawless. Strike hard, strike fast, establish a defensive perimeter so vast that America would sue for peace rather than fight across an ocean to reclaim worthless atolls. They had studied American character and found it soft, materialistic, divided. Americans loved comfort. They would not endure years of sacrifice for islands they could not pronounce. But something had gone wrong in the calculus, something the Japanese had not accounted for, not American carriers, which by luck or providence had been absent from Pearl Harbor that December morning. Not American industrial capacity, though that would matter soon enough. What they had not accounted for was this: a small team of mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers who had turned Japanese confidence into a weapon against itself. The story begins not with warships, but with words, specifically, with the hubris of believing your words are safe. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, as Japan expanded into China and eyed the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, its navy communicated using a cipher machine they called Angoki Type B. Type B cipher machine. The Americans would come to know it as JN-25. It was a sophisticated system, a book code, combined with an additive cipher that changed regularly. To Japanese cryptographers, it seemed unbreakable. Messages were encoded using a codebook that assigned 5-digit numbers to words, phrases, and common naval terms, then obscured by adding a second 5-digit number from a separate additive book. Without both books, without understanding the mathematical patterns, the messages appeared as meaningless strings of numbers transmitted in Morse code across the Pacific darkness. But there were men who saw patterns where others saw chaos. In a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo hummed with quiet intensity. It was not a glamorous place. Fluorescent lights flickered over tables covered with worksheets, columned numbers, frequency charts. The air conditioning rattled and wheezed, fighting the Hawaiian heat and losing. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the station's chief, often worked in his bathrobe and slippers, sustained by coffee and cigarettes, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Around him worked a collection of men who, in peacetime, had been academics, musicians, amateur puzzle enthusiasts, men who loved the elegant logic of languages, the hidden architecture of communication. They had been breaking into JN-25 for months, slowly, partially, building dictionaries of code groups, identifying patterns, stealing fragments of meaning from the noise. It was painstaking work. They might spend weeks on a single message, comparing it with others, looking for repeated phrases, known words, predictable formats. Japanese radio operators had habits, patterns. Messages began with standard formalities. Weather reports used common vocabulary. Slowly, group by group, the dictionary grew. By May 1942, Rochefort's team could read perhaps 40% of intercepted messages, enough to glimpse intentions, enough to see the shape of something large forming beyond the horizon. And what they saw made them certain. Yamamoto was planning something massive. The intercepts spoke of a coming operation, a decisive battle. But where? One designation appeared repeatedly in the messages. AF. The target was AF. But what was AF? Rochefort believed it was Midway. The atoll sat strategically at the far northwestern end of the Hawaiian chain, 1,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. Taking it would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, threaten Hawaii itself, and force the American carriers into a battle they could not avoid. But belief was not proof. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed certainty before committing his outnumbered carriers to a confrontation that could lose the war. So Rochefort devised a test, simple and brilliant. He instructed Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. The message went out. Rochefort's team listened. 2 days later, Japanese radio traffic carried a message. AF reports shortage of fresh water. AF was Midway. The puzzle was solved. What followed was not miraculous, it was methodical. As Japanese preparations accelerated through late May, Station Hypo intercepted, decoded, and translated a stream of operational orders. Sailing dates, fleet compositions, radio call signs, refueling schedules. The codebreakers identified which carriers would participate. Akagi, Kaga, Soru, Hiru, the same 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor. They determined the attack would come in early June. They plotted approach vectors. Rochefort worked 72-hour stretches without sleep, surviving on coffee and sardine sandwiches, his staff rotating in shifts around him, typing, calculating, cross-referencing. By June 1st, Nimitz possessed something unprecedented in naval warfare, complete foreknowledge of his enemy's plan. Aboard Akagi, steaming eastward under radio silence, Commander Genda felt no premonition of disaster. Why would he? The operation plan was magnificent in its complexity. The carrier strike force would approach from the northwest, launch at dawn, obliterate Midway's defenses. Simultaneously, an invasion force would land troops to seize the atoll. When American carriers rushed from Pearl Harbor to defend Midway, as they certainly would, the Japanese fleet would be positioned to ambush them. Yamamoto himself would command from the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carriers, ready to finish any survivors with his massive guns. The Americans would be outnumbered, surprised, and destroyed. After Midway fell, perhaps Hawaii itself would be threatened. Perhaps America would negotiate. Perhaps this war, begun with such spectacular success at Pearl Harbor, would end with Japan's empire secure and the Pacific transformed into a Japanese lake. These expectations, born of 6 months of unbroken victory, were not foolish. They were reasonable extrapolations from experience. Since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had operated with impunity. Their pilots were the best trained in the world, veterans of combat over China. Their torpedoes were superior. Their night-fighting tactics were unmatched. They had earned their confidence. But confidence, like codes, can be broken. June 4th, 1942. 0430 hours. 200 miles northeast of Midway. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher sat aboard the carrier Yorktown, studying reconnaissance reports. Around him, unseen by the approaching Japanese, were 31 American warships, including 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown herself, barely repaired from damage at the Coral Sea. The American fleet had arrived 2 days earlier and positioned itself precisely where Rochefort's intelligence predicted the Japanese would not expect them northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese scouts, waiting in ambush. Every captain knew what was at stake. The United States Navy had been given a gift, a chance to turn the war with a single throw of the dice. But dice, even loaded, can tumble in unexpected directions. At 0534 hours, a Japanese scout plane spotted the American fleet. The message reached Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, just as his first wave was striking Midway. The news should have been galvanizing. The Americans were here, exactly as planned. But timing is everything in war, and the timing was catastrophic. Nagumo's aircraft had launched armed with bombs for attacking Midway's installations. If he wanted to strike American carriers, he needed torpedoes. He gave the order to rearm. On the hangar decks of 4 Japanese carriers, organized chaos erupted. Deck crews removed bombs from aircraft, rolled torpedoes into position, refueled planes. Bombs and fuel lines lay exposed on the decks. It would take an hour, perhaps 90 minutes. The American carriers were not going anywhere. There was time. There was not time. At 0700 hours, American torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet. They attacked in desperate, uncoordinated waves. First Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, 15 Douglas Devastators flying low and slow, without fighter escort, into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and Zeros. They pressed their attack with suicidal courage. All 15 were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. Then Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, 10 more Devastators, 10 more crews lost. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. The ocean around the Japanese fleet became a graveyard of burning aircraft and floating debris. Aboard Akagi, as the last American torpedo bombers fell into the sea, Japanese sailors cheered. They had won. They had beaten off the attack without suffering a single hit. The American carriers had revealed their position, wasted their strength, and accomplished nothing. In that moment of triumph, at 1022 hours, the dive bombers arrived. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Douglas Dauntlesses from Enterprise, had nearly missed the battle. He had flown to where intelligence said the Japanese would be and found empty ocean. He had made a decision not to return to his carrier but to search. Following a hunch, following a lone Japanese destroyer he spotted making high speed, he had turned northeast. And there, spread below him like models on a table, were the 4 carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed, fuel lines snaking across the wooden planking, completely vulnerable. McCluskey pushed over into his dive. 37 aircraft followed, screaming down from 17,000 feet, their dive brakes howling. The Zeros that had decimated the torpedo bombers were all at low altitude, out of position, unable to climb fast enough. The anti-aircraft gunners were reloading, tracking new targets, caught between threats. The first bomb struck Kaga near the bridge, then another, then 3 more in quick succession, plunging through the flight deck into the hangar where bombs and torpedoes sat exposed. The carrier erupted in a pillar of flame. Akagi took 1 bomb, just 1, but it struck the edge of the flight deck elevator, penetrated to the hangar, and detonated among the rearming aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Within minutes, fires raged out of control. Soryu absorbed 3 bombs in 2 minutes. She was doomed before her crew understood what had happened. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks. The 4th, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that crippled Yorktown. But by afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu too. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or abandoned, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and crew. But this is not merely the story of a battle. It is the story of expectation shattered by knowledge, confidence destroyed by information, and how the breaking of a code broke the momentum of an empire. In the weeks following Midway, as Japan absorbed the magnitude of the disaster, questions circulated among officers who survived. How had the Americans known? How had they been positioned so perfectly? Some suspected espionage, others pointed to operational security failures. A few, very few, wondered about the codes. Commander Genda, rescued from the burning Akagi, would later write in his diary about the uncanny precision of American movements, as though the enemy had read their mail. He was closer to the truth than he knew. Admiral Yamamoto ordered an investigation into communications security, but the findings were inconclusive. The cryptographers insisted JN-25 remained secure. Most officers accepted this because the alternative was too disturbing, that their most secret thoughts, transmitted across the vast Pacific, had been transparent to the enemy for months. There is a peculiar psychology to being the victim of code-breaking. It creates paranoia not about what you have said, but about what you will say. After Midway, Japanese communications became more cautious, more vague, more reliant on face-to-face meetings and couriers. Ironically, this made coordination more difficult. The vast Pacific, which had seemed Japan's natural defensive barrier, became an obstacle to their own command structure. Orders were delayed, responses were slow. The network of bases stretching from Rabaul to Truk to the Solomons found itself operating with increasing independence, less certainty about strategic priorities. Meanwhile, Station Hypo continued its quiet work. Rochefort and his team tracked fleet movements, identified targets, predicted operations. When Japan reinforced Guadalcanal, codebreakers warned of convoy timings. When Yamamoto himself planned an inspection tour of forward bases in April 1943, Station Hypo intercepted his itinerary, complete with flight times, routes, and aircraft types. American P-38 fighters intercepted his plane over Bougainville and shot it down. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor died because cryptanalysts had read his calendar. This was warfare transformed. Not the clash of battleships that dominated naval thinking for 50 years, not even the carrier duels that defined the Pacific War's early phase, but something more subtle and more decisive: information dominance. To know your enemy's plans was to negate his advantages. Japanese carriers were no less formidable after Midway. Their pilots, though losses mounted, remained skilled, but they operated increasingly in a fog, while American commanders saw with borrowed clarity through intercepted messages. There is a symbolic object that recurs in accounts from Station Hypo during those critical months: the coffee cup. Not military issue, not standardized, but personal mugs brought from home, chipped ceramic vessels that sat beside worksheets covered in 5-digit number groups. Rochefort drank coffee constantly, mechanically, barely tasting it. His team members did the same. In photographs from Pearl Harbor, these cups appear on tables, next to ashtrays and stacks of decrypt drafts, mundane objects in an unmundane place. The coffee cup represents something essential about how democracies wage war, not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but with persistence, with the grinding application of intellect and resources, with the unglamorous work of men in basements who never fire a shot but who win battles by thinking harder than the enemy. The Japanese Navy trained for the decisive engagement, the climactic battle where skill and spirit would triumph. They did not train for the slow attrition of having their every move anticipated, their every plan compromised, their every advantage eroded by an enemy who simply knew more. This is not to diminish Japanese courage or skill. The men who flew from Akagi and Kaga that morning were among the finest naval aviators in the world. The torpedo bomber pilots who pressed home their attacks despite overwhelming defenses demonstrated heroism equal to any in history. But heroism without intelligence is squandered. Skill without information is blunted. The tragedy of Midway, from the Japanese perspective, was not that they fought poorly, but that they fought blind against an enemy who could see. By late 1942, American codebreaking had expanded beyond Station Hypo. Additional facilities in Washington and Melbourne processed thousands of intercepts daily. New cipher systems were attacked and broken. Japanese army codes, diplomatic codes, merchant shipping codes, all came under assault by growing teams of cryptanalysts. The intelligence derived from these sources, codenamed Magic and Ultra in American usage, flowed to commanders throughout the Pacific, enabling decisions that consistently wrong-footed Japanese planning. When Japan attempted to reinforce Buna in New Guinea, codebreakers identified the convoy route and timing. American aircraft sank the transports in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. When Japanese submarines operated in the South Pacific, decrypted messages revealed their patrol areas, allowing convoys to be routed around them. When the Imperial Navy planned Operation I-Go, a massive air offensive against Allied positions in the Solomons, station intercepts provided advance warning, and reinforcements arrived before the attacks began. Each incident individually might seem unremarkable, the normal friction of war. But cumulatively, consistently, the pattern became undeniable. American forces were rarely surprised, often positioned optimally, consistently seemed to anticipate Japanese movements. To Japanese commanders in the field, it felt like fighting an opponent who could read minds. The reality was both more prosaic and more devastating. The opponent was reading telegrams. In Tokyo, some officers began to understand. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, whose plane crashed in the Philippines in 1944 carrying documents that fell into Allied hands, later acknowledged that American intelligence capabilities had been terrifyingly accurate. But by then, understanding changed nothing. The war's momentum had shifted irreversibly. The industrial giant that Japan's planners had hoped would seek negotiated peace instead mobilized completely, producing warships and aircraft at rates that eclipsed Japanese capacity. Codebreaking had bought time for that mobilization to take effect, had prevented early disasters that might have forced premature American compromises. Consider the counterfactual. What if Station Hypo had not broken JN-25? What if the test with Midway's water supply had failed or been inconclusive? What if Nimitz, lacking intelligence, had positioned his carriers defensively near Hawaii, waiting for an attack that came at Midway instead? The Japanese would have taken the atoll. American carriers, responding belatedly, might have been ambushed as planned. The Pacific Fleet could have been crippled beyond quick recovery. The timetable of the Pacific War would have stretched, perhaps by years. Australia might have been isolated. The atomic bombs, when finally ready in 1945, might have been dropped on a Japan still controlling vast territories, still convinced that resistance could extract concessions. But that is not what happened. What happened is that a commander in a bathrobe, working in a basement, drinking lukewarm coffee, broke the enemy's cipher and changed the war. What happened is that information became the decisive weapon, more potent than battleships or bombers, because it allowed those battleships and bombers to be in the right place at the right moment. This is the story Japanese officers could not believe, that the elaborate secrecy, the radio silence, the confidence in technological sophistication, all of it had been penetrated by patient mathematics and relentless logic. It violated their sense of operational security, their confidence in their own cryptographic systems. It introduced uncertainty into what had seemed certain, inserted paranoia into what had been confidence. There is a moment preserved in post-war interrogations that captures this disbelief perfectly. A Japanese naval officer, questioned about communications security, insisted that American intelligence must have relied on spies or captured documents. The interrogator pressed, "What about code breaking?" The officer's response was telling, "Impossible. Our codes changed regularly. The mathematics were too complex. You would need to know too much." The interrogator simply showed him a decrypt of a message the officer himself had sent, word for word, dated before the battle. The officer read it in silence. When he looked up, his face showed not anger but something closer to existential confusion, the bewilderment of discovering the ground beneath you had been glass all along, and your enemy had been watching from below. This is what intelligence warfare does. It does not merely confer tactical advantage, it undermines psychological certainty. Once you know the enemy has been reading your communications, every past decision becomes suspect. Did they let that convoy through? Did they avoid that sector because they knew we had submarines there? Were they preparing that ambush because they read our orders? The paranoia spreads backward through time, contaminating memory, making every anomaly seem like evidence of compromise. The Imperial Japanese Navy never fully recovered its confidence after Midway. They won tactical victories, Savo Island, Tassafaronga, but these were local successes in a deteriorating strategic position. They continued to communicate, because navies must communicate across oceanic distances, but the implicit trust in those communications had been damaged. And all the while, in basements and back rooms across the Pacific, the coffee cups accumulated, the worksheets piled higher, and the decrypts kept coming. By 1945, as American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, the code-breaking apparatus had become enormous, thousands of personnel, industrial-scale processing of intercepts, integration with tactical operations at every level. It was no longer about single dramatic successes like Midway, but about comprehensive information dominance. Japanese merchant shipping routes were known. Fleet movements were tracked. Defensive preparations were observed through decrypted communications. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American intelligence had been reading diplomatic traffic about peace feelers, internal debates about surrender terms, desperate attempts to secure Soviet mediation. The war ended. The victors occupied Japan. And slowly, carefully, the story of the codebreakers emerged. For Japanese officers learning this history, it must have been a peculiar form of retrospective defeat, discovering that the war they remembered fighting was not quite the war that had actually occurred. They had fought bravely, skillfully, often brilliantly, but always against an enemy who knew more than any enemy should know. They had sent their plans by radio into the darkness, confident in cryptographic security, not knowing that in Hawaii and Washington and Melbourne, those plans were being read, analyzed, and countered before the transmissions even finished. Commander Genda survived the war. He became a post-war politician, eventually serving in Japan's self-defense forces during the Cold War. In interviews late in life, he spoke about Midway with the detachment of historical distance. He acknowledged the code-breaking, accepted its impact, even expressed a kind of professional admiration for Rochefort and his team. But he also admitted that when he first learned the full extent of American intelligence penetration, his initial reaction was simple disbelief. Not because the technical capability seemed impossible by the post-war era, computers and cryptography had advanced dramatically, but because he could not reconcile it with his memory of that night aboard a Kagi. Steaming toward Midway, certain of surprise, confident in operational security, tasting victory before dawn. That confidence, preserved in his diary entries from June 3rd, 1942, reads now like tragic irony. All preparations complete. The enemy is unaware. Tomorrow we strike. Every word was true except the middle sentence, and that single error made the other truths irrelevant. This is the nature of intelligence warfare. It is invisible until it is decisive. The Japanese sailors who died at Midway never knew they had been compromised. The pilots who launched from Akagi that morning flew with absolute commitment, believing in surprise, trusting their mission. They were betrayed not by cowardice or incompetence, but by mathematics they could not see. By patient men drinking coffee in a basement 3,000 miles away, by the slow accretion of knowledge transforming into actionable intelligence. And what does this mean, in the end? What truth does Midway, refracted through the lens of broken codes, reveal about war and freedom and the nature of conflict between ideologies? Perhaps this: that democracies, for all their inefficiencies and debates and surface confusion, possess a structural advantage in long wars. They are transparent to themselves in ways that make them better at managing information. The men at Station Hypo came from universities, from civilian life, brought in because of their minds rather than their military credentials. Rochefort was a linguist and a poker player before he was a commander. His team included amateur cryptographers, music theorists, a former Treasury Department economist. This diversity of thought, This willingness to value intellect over rank gave American intelligence a flexibility that rigid military hierarchies struggled to match. The Japanese Navy was magnificent in many ways, but it was hierarchical, formal, resistant to lateral thinking. When their codes were questioned, institutional inertia resisted change. When anomalies appeared in American responses, explanations were sought that preserved the assumption of cryptographic security. The possibility that the codes had been broken fundamentally was too threatening to established expertise, too damaging to institutional confidence. So they continued transmitting, and Station Hypo continued reading, and the war turned on information as much as on steel and explosives and blood. There is a photograph, taken in 1943, of the Station Hypo team receiving commendations. They stand in formation, these men who changed the war, looking uncomfortable in dress uniforms, squinting in bright Hawaiian sunlight after months of fluorescent twilight. Rochefort is in the front row, his ribbons slightly crooked, his expression weary. None of them look like traditional heroes. They look like accountants, like professors, like the kind of men who would be anonymous in any crowd. But they won Midway, not the pilots, not alone, and not the admirals, though their courage and decisions mattered. The battle was won in a basement, 6 months before the first bomb fell, by men who saw patterns in numbers and built a dictionary one code group at a time and stayed awake for 72 hours, drinking bad coffee because the work mattered more than sleep. The coffee cups, the worksheets, the quiet persistence. These are the symbols of how free societies wage existential wars, not just with heroism, though heroism matters, but with the patient application of human intelligence, the collaboration of diverse minds working toward a common goal, the willingness to trust civilians in uniform because expertise matters more than tradition. Japanese officers could not believe American codebreakers had anticipated their fleet movements at Midway because belief requires imagination, and imagination requires the ability to conceive of a system fundamentally different from your own. They imagined American intelligence as they would organize it themselves, hierarchical, formal, strictly military. They could not imagine a commander working in a bathrobe, could not imagine musicians and mathematicians decrypting naval operations, could not imagine the creative chaos that democracy, for all its faults, sometimes enables. And so they steamed toward Midway confident in surprise, while the enemy waited in ambush, forewarned and forearmed, guided by words the Japanese thought were secret, but which had been transparent all along, turned from cipher to clarity by patience and coffee, and the particular genius that free societies can mobilize when survival demands it. That is the truth of Midway. Not just that America won a battle, but how and what that victory revealed about the nature of information, the power of knowledge, and the way wars are decided not only by who fights harder but by who thinks clearer, who sees further, who breaks the code while the enemy still believes it holds. The darkness before that June dawn held many secrets. But the most important secret of all was this: the darkness was not equally dark for both sides. One side possessed light they did not know they had. The other groped in shadow they did not know existed. And when dawn came, the light revealed ships positioned with impossible precision, strikes launched at perfect moments, a battle that seemed miraculous but was merely mathematical. Commander Genda, standing on Akagi's flight deck in the last moments before the world changed, could not have imagined this. He tasted salt air and smelled aviation fuel, and felt the carrier's deck beneath his boots, and believed what all his training and experience told him to believe: that they were about to deliver a surprise attack on an unsuspecting enemy. 3,000 miles away, Commander Rochefort sat at his desk, reading the latest decrypt, sipping coffee gone cold hours ago, and knew better, knew the Japanese were coming, knew where, knew when, knew the surprise would be theirs, not Japan's. And that knowledge, purchased through patience and mathematics and sleepless nights, was the weapon that won the battle before the first aircraft launched, before the first bomb fell, before the first ship burned. In the end, The greatest shock was not the defeat itself, but the discovery of how thoroughly they had been known, how completely their secrets had been penetrated, how the enemy they had thought blind had been watching all along. Japanese officers could not believe it, because believing it required accepting that the war they remembered had been different from the war they fought, that they had been not participants in an equal struggle, but actors in a play whose script the audience had already read, performing with conviction and courage, moves the other side had seen coming from the start. That is what codebreaking did at Midway. It transformed fog of war into clarity, turned uncertainty into knowledge, made the future predictable enough to ambush. The coffee cups sit silent in museum displays now, next to decrypts and code sheets and photographs of men who look like accountants and changed history. They are symbols of a particular kind of victory, quiet, methodical, unglamorous, decisive, the victory of information over force, of patience over speed, of the slow accumulation of knowledge over the quick strike of violence. And somewhere in the dark waters north of Midway, the wreck of Akagi lies in eternal darkness, her secrets finally safe because there is no one left to hide them from, no messages left to encrypt, only the silence of deep water and the question that haunts all defeated confidence. How did they know? The answer, spoken across decades by empty coffee cups and fading worksheets, is simple and profound. Because we broke your code. Because we read your mail. Because while you planned in secret, we listened in silence. Because information is power, and knowledge is victory, and democracy, for all its noise and chaos, sometimes produces the quiet genius that changes everything. That is the truth that Japanese officers could not believe, and the truth that won Midway, and the truth that echoes still across the dark Pacific where confidence met clarity and lost.